Those who don't know me, I'm Professor Andrew Lockyer, and I'm the Honorary Stevenson Professor of Citizenship, still here. And it's my duty, pleasure today to say a few words of introduction to introduce our chairman, and our chairman is going to introduce the speaker. But today's lecture is a bit out of the ordinary because today is not just a Stevenson lecture, it's also a Mackenzie lecture. And it's fallen upon me to say a few words about Bill Mackenzie, the professor at Glasgow and at Manchester, who is honoured by the lectures that are internally given in the university. So before I introduce our chairman, who you all know, I just want to say a few words about W.J.M. Mackenzie, Bill Mackenzie. And when this happened, when I knew that I was being asked to say something about Bill, I thought that it would be a great thing that this would be an opportunity to mention the connection that Glasgow has with Manchester, the academic institutions and the city itself. But as you'll know, because events this week, Monday of this week, this has given this a particular poignancy at a time when it's appropriate for us to identify with colleagues and citizens in other places. It did make it seem a particular obligation to recognise what has happened in Manchester. Perhaps also to thank our speaker for continuing with our proceedings. We did at one point think, should we, given the dreadful events in Manchester, suspend these lectures, but we decided, as has the rest of the citizens of Manchester, it seems, to carry on as normal. And carrying on as normal included Manchester United winning a very important football match yesterday. And although that in no way detracts from the tragic events on Monday, it does mean we're part of the approach to our relations with Manchester, which is to carry on as normal and do the best we can. But it's in acknowledging of those terrible events that we've decided to continue. Our sympathies remain, of course, with the families and the bereaved of that dreadful event. I suppose it leads us also to think, explaining what happens in the political world, which includes that which happens beyond the political world. Terrorism in this world is a tremendous challenge upon us all, as academics and citizens as well, but we continue to attempt to understand and explain and make sense of what happens, and really that's an obligation of all of those who study politics. And it was certainly the message which we had from Bill Mackenzie, who was, for 8 years, he was the professor of politics at Glasgow. Bill, where did we start? Came back to Glasgow in 1966 after having spent 18 years in Manchester leading the Department of Politics and Administration in Manchester. In 1966, it was Charles Wilson, the person whose this building is named after, the Chancellor, who Mackenzie knew in Oxford, that persuaded him in his late 1950s to come back to Glasgow. So he came back in 1966. Bill then was 58. Bill Mackenzie was an Edinburgh graduate, and he studied law in Edinburgh, and then he went to Oxford. He just went to school in Edinburgh, and he studied Greats at Oxford. Greats means you study classical Greek and Roman history and philosophy. He studied Greats at Oxford, and then in the interwar years, he had a job in the Air Ministry, advising on the administration of the British defences, and he spent quite a lot of time with the notion that, and it always was an obligation of Oxford academics that they saw themselves of having a duty to adopt public office and to advise in public administration. So I suppose Bill started off in public administration. But his first, when he went back to Oxford briefly to teach political philosophy and economics, PPE, and then in 1948, he is essentially credited with establishing the Manchester department. And without going into great lengths about Bill's career at Manchester, during the 18 years that Bill was at Manchester, he established really the first politics department that really focused on research. Bill's view was that you had to understand the whole of political reality, and that nothing ought to be, no discipline ought to be left out of the challenge. Politics, in a sense, was the master discipline, and he surrounded himself by academics in Manchester for 18 years who were leaders in their field. It's pointed out that there were 24 senior professors came out of Manchester during Bill's time, and it was pretty much acknowledged, except for the LSE, Manchester was the leading place to be, and it was essentially that Bill Mackenzie's influence. Bill is accredited with being one of the fathers of the doctrine of social science. He was on the SSRC Committee of Politics when that was first established. He established the political studies in 1950. Bill was a leading light in politics. But Bill's approach was politics was always a lot more than politics. It was, of course, we had to study economics, philosophy, but we had to study history, and we had to study anthropology, and it would help us if we studied the biological sciences. So if you're in Bill's department, you're expected to know everything about everything. And Bill seemed to. My experience of him was being appointed in Glasgow in 1970. Bill had there were two chairs in Glasgow. The first chair was the James Bryce chair, which Bill occupied. Bryce was an expert on American politics, which Bill knew a lot about. When D.D. Raphael came in 1970, when D.D. Raphael left in 1970, Bill moved over to the philosophy, the political theory chair, and he taught political theory. Bill appointed me to teach about Karl Marx, but he never wanted anyone to think, no student of politics or the social sciences shouldn't know about Marx. But to know about Marx, you had to know about the real Marx. And so someone who studied Marx in the influence of Hegel on Marx is important. But to understand Marx more, you had to understand that Marx did his dissertation on the Greeks. And really, Athenian law was the thing that you had to understand in order to know your background on Hegel and to understand Marx. So you can imagine, as a first-year lecturer, I'm thinking that I knew my subjects, and Bill was telling me that a lot more that I needed to know. And that essentially is how Bill worked. He worked with his colleagues in such a way that he always made you think that you needed to know a bit more. You always did need to know a bit more, and Bill always knew a bit more about it than the rest of you. And he was a tremendous inspiration to all of the teachers, both at Manchester and at Glasgow. So much so that he received many honorary degrees, 5 or 6 honorary degrees. He received public honours. He was always on every committee that was ever appointed in Manchester and in Glasgow that involved politics having a say in affairs. He even told me when I joined that if I knew about punishment, he was on the Children's Panel Advisory Committee. You need to do something about it, and you need to serve in the public arena. And that was one of his views as well, that politics had to explain the most difficult things to your colleagues, firstly. You had to establish a whole range of lectures. You had to go to each other's lectures. You had to go to the lectures in other adjacent subjects, which was just about every subject under the sun. And then it was your duty to pass this wisdom on to the public. So you also had to do public service as well. So all of those people who appointed my time, you wonder why we publish so little, because we spent our time filling in Bill Mackenzie's view of what a good academic should be. It was do your research, teach your students, and also do your public duty and deliver public service. And I suppose it was for that reason that Bill was such an enthusiast for Stevenson, which is where we are at today. So the Stevenson endeavour was greatly supported by Bill Mackenzie, and this being a Stevenson-Mackenzie lecture is a matter of great privilege and importance. And one of the other things Bill said is you have to listen to academics from other institutions as well, even Strathclyde. So in the spirit of that, I'm going to hand you over to John Curtis, who's going to formally introduce the speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you for those warm words, Andrew. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Robert Ford this evening. You'll soon know why. not the first experience I had with Robert, but one of the relatively early experiences that I had the privilege to be his external examiner for his PhD thesis, and he managed to survive that experience. He is, in fact, one of the members of the exit poll team, which is currently dripping sweat over the fact that we're having to run an exit poll when we didn't expect we were going to have to do so, and indeed is much more broadly to be found on the BBC, The Economist, writing particularly for The Observer these days. Meanwhile, he's also probably written more successful books than most political scientists have managed in a lifetime. He was the co-author with Matthew Goodwin of a book called Revolt on the Right, which is the book on the rise of UKIP up to 2015. And then to also give you an idea that he has a certain mischievous sense of humour, and indeed, if you ever needed convincing that actually psephology was all rather interesting and fun, he, with Philip Cowley, is co-editor of 2 books. The first was called Sex, Lies and the Ballot Box, and the follow-up was called More Sex, Lies and the Ballot Box. And rumour has it, it sells better than any other political science book that's currently around. Rob does research in political behaviour, voting behaviour, electoral choice. He still has a particular interest in the subject matter of his thesis, which is indeed the impact of immigration on political behaviour and electoral choice in the UK, as well as immigration policy more generally. And that, in a sense, that backdrop enables you to understand what he's talking about this evening, which is effectively to look at the legacy of 2 referendums. One, the independence referendum here, the other, the EU referendum across the whole of the UK, both of which in their various ways were responses to the electoral success of various different kinds of nationalist parties, but where it appears as though the fallout has been particularly unfortunate for the Labour Party in particular, though there is still 2 weeks to go for it to recover, but there we are. So anyway, I invite you to listen to Rob, and Rob, please, we look forward very much indeed to your lecture.
Thank you very much, John. There's a slight change because this is actually drawing on work that I'm working on, hopefully a forthcoming book that I'm writing with my colleague from Manchester and also my wife, Maria Sobolewska. So that's an experiment in co-authoring in a marriage that I've not undertaken before. We'll see how it goes. If there's any lawyers in here, then... But thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you to Glasgow for the invitation. It's a huge honour to talk in a series with Bill Mackenzie's name on it. When I arrived in Manchester 10 years ago, I was reminded regularly by long-serving members of the department that this was Bill Mackenzie's department and Bill Mackenzie's legacy. And it's a very proud thing to be part of that department, and a very proud thing to give a lecture associated with Bill. Bill Mackenzie's approach to political science, which he summed up in a quote that I found doing background for this talk, is that the job that I have, that John has, that all of us have or should have, is to talk in an orderly manner, paying regard to consistency and verifiability about a unique situation which is extremely complex and changes rapidly. Well, a unique situation which is extremely complex and changes rapidly, I can't think of a better summary of where we are with politics right now. And so I'm now going to try and spend an hour talking in an orderly manner, paying appropriate regard to consistency and verifiability, to try and make sense of this crazy mess that we've found ourselves in. Before I do so, I'd just like to also pay tribute back to John, because I think of all the political scientists working in Britain today, probably no one quite epitomises Bill Mackenzie's approach as well as John does. He manages to talk in an orderly manner about complex political things as they are happening in the middle of the night, on election night, every election night. He doesn't sleep, he never misses a beat, and he never gets it wrong. It's a terrific talent. And on top of all of that, in an era when impact has become tremendously important for academics, he manages to engage beyond the typical sort of spheres of political fanatics who stay up all night on election night, and has become a cult figure on youth-oriented sites such as BuzzFeed. who ran an article last time urging their readers to show their love and respect for John Curtis, feelings I would very much encourage you to echo. So, on to the matter at hand. The past 6 years have probably been the best 6 years to be a student of politics and the worst 6 years to be a practitioner of politics in my lifetime. Over and over again, we have had extraordinary shocks at the ballot box that have upended expectations and fundamentally changed how things are going. Over and over, things that weren't supposed to happen, weren't supposed to be possible, have happened and have become the political reality. So before I get on to trying to explain these things, I just want to run through them and remind you just quite how far we have travelled in a relatively short space of time. It is only 6 years ago that the SNP achieved a majority in the Scottish Parliament that was deemed to be impossible by design. The electoral system used in the Scottish Parliament was supposed to prevent a nationalist party from being able to have an absolute majority in Parliament and thereby being able to advance the issue of independence. But the SNP, in the course of 2 election cycles, doubled its vote on both the constituency and the seat bonus, at which point the system that had been designed to thwart their aspirations to a majority started to assist them. And they ended up, much to their surprise, as well as everybody else's, with a majority in the Scottish Parliament, which leads, of course, to the second big shock a few years later, when the independence referendum. When the SNP called for that vote, they were not expecting to win it. They thought this was going to be a huge gamble. They had to do it because, having won a majority in the Scottish Parliament, they had to fulfil the aspirations of their activists to give the Scottish people a chance to vote for independence. But at the time when they were setting this up, that first black dotted line is the Edinburgh Agreement that gave the Scottish Parliament the authority to go ahead with a referendum. At that point, the no side had a 20-point lead, and they continued to have a 20-point lead all the way through to the formal campaign period. And then sometime in the final weeks of that election campaign, something shifted drastically and support for yes shot up. I was here in Glasgow with John at the time, and I remember one of the nights we went out, I think it might have been out with Chris Carman to have a curry, and I heard people at a stag do on the next table discussing the pros and cons of independence. Now, I might do that at a stag do, but I'm not normally encouraged to. To have people doing it voluntarily who didn't seem to be politics professors was quite an extraordinary thing and pointed to the fact that something very unusual was going on. Then we had the results, and in the end, the excitement over yes did not actually result in the fundamental shift that some of the SNP had been hoping for in the final days. But they came a lot closer than they expected. And then we had another unexpected earthquake when the support for the SNP at Westminster more than doubled. The side that lost ended up being the side that won less than a year later. And again, this took everyone by surprise. The Labour Party, many of the Labour MPs in this city, did not expect to lose. They had majorities the size of the Himalayas. They weighed their votes around here. They didn't count them. And yet nearly every one of them lost, much to their surprise. And again, it was an enormous shift. In fact, the scale of the swing was the second largest that has been seen in a constituent nation of the United Kingdom in any election on record. There's only been one swing larger than that in any constituent nation of the UK ever. I wonder if anybody can guess what it is. Anybody apart perhaps from John, who probably does know. Any guesses? No. Way, way smaller. Well, John does know it. It was Ireland 1910 to 1918. In between, the parliamentary party was already the big majority party in Ireland, but then during the First World War, Sinn Féin was founded, And they emerged on the scene with 47% of the vote and 70% of the seats and completely demolished the Irish Parliamentary Party. And that election sounded the end of Ireland's involvement in the United Kingdom. So the only time before this when a party has achieved a bigger electoral swing than the Scottish National Party did in 2015, it was another nationalist party, and it ended very soon after with that nation leaving the United Kingdom. So historically this was a quite unusual result, and what that points to, which is what I will return to, is the extraordinary power of national identity as a force to change people's political behaviour. But then all of us start thinking, okay, well, the SNP are on top now and they're going to be on top for a while, and then the next year something else happens, which if you'd have gone back sort of 10 years in history and said to people it was going to happen, they would have laughed at you, which is that all of a sudden parts of Scotland started to rediscover an affection for the Conservative Party. This, again, was not something anybody really expected to see even a few years ago. And in 2016, we saw the Conservatives increasing their vote on both ballots by 9 to 10 percentage points to the highest that they had received since devolution, and with some truly stunning constituency results such as Ruth Davidson's victory. At the same time, Labour continued its slow descent into a kind of marginal third place position. The party that had dominated Scottish politics for 3 generations now found itself in a dogfight for third place with the Conservative Party, the party that they had built that dominance on opposing for so long. Once again, an extraordinary change. So that's Scotland, which I guess you all know a fair amount about, having lived, I imagine, most of you through all of that. But also we've seen some extraordinary changes south of the border in England. The first was the European Parliament election in 2014, just a few months before the Scots voted on independence from the United Kingdom. The English delivered the first nationwide victory for a party other than Labour and the Conservatives in over a century, and they delivered it to a party that was pledged to deliver independence for the United Kingdom from Europe, the UK Independence Party, who secured 27% of the vote in that particular election. A year after that, UKIP did not quite manage the success of the SNP north of the border. What they managed to do was to demonstrate the effects of our electoral system, something which longer-standing SNP activists were very familiar with. They secured 14% of the vote, but got just 1 seat in return for that. So in parliamentary terms, it was an altogether invisible revolt. Post-2015, the SNP have replaced the Liberal Democrats as the third party at Prime Minister's Question Time, so they've become a powerful voice of opposition to the government. They have a high-profile structural role. But UKIP got 3 times as many votes, and in return, they got just 1 MP who didn't even stick around very long, and he didn't really get to ask very many questions at all, even if he was inclined to. And then on the other side of the ledger, we had the unexpected majority, the exit poll, which John mentioned that we're both involved with. Well, 2015 was a particularly fun one to be involved with, because we all knew when 10 o'clock came and Big Ben chimed that all hell was going to break loose, because this was not something that had been seen coming in any of the polling. And what it was built on the back of was an unexpected recovery for the Conservatives, particularly in England, where they won 60% of the seats. And it was the first time since 1832 that a governing party had increased its vote share and its number of seats. So once again, something was happening that hadn't happened for a hell of a long time. Meanwhile, UKIP secured the best share of the vote by a new party since either 1983, if you want to classify the SDP as a new party rather than a split from the Labour Party, or since the 1920s in Labour itself. So again, history was being made even if MPs were not being returned. And of course, all that proved to be the prelude for what was perhaps the biggest shake-up of all 1 year later, when the United Kingdom, or at least the English and Welsh bits of it, voted to leave the European Union. And once again, this was something that a year out from the vote did not look particularly likely. There were fairly solid leads for the Remain side. And then as the campaign rolled on, the vote gradually slided towards the Leave option. But even on the night you had the betting markets at that point rated the Remain side as a 92% chance of victory before, just 5 minutes before the first result was announced. And that bottom graph here, the one that goes sliding down like a roller coaster, that's the pound against the dollar as the results came in. So clearly the currency traders didn't see this coming, and they didn't particularly like what they saw on the night. And all of that brings us to the election that will come in another couple of weeks, where once again it looks like history of a kind will be made. We look set at the moment to see a Conservative Party win a share of the vote that hasn't been seen since probably the 1950s, upwards of 45%, close to 50%. That's what much of the polling was showing before this week's events in Manchester put a stop to campaigning. And here that is in historical perspective. This is the share of the vote won by each Conservative Prime Minister who won a majority since the Second World War. And as you'll see, from Macmillan onwards, they've gradually slid downwards, because one of the things that I was brought up in as an undergraduate and a postgraduate student was that politics is fragmenting. Two-party politics and 50% votes are a thing of the past. We are now too fragmented and divided a nation for that kind of thing. And yet here we are with Theresa May constructing what looks like a 45 to 50% coalition again. And once again, that's something that even a couple of years ago, even with all of these other disruptions, did not look like it was going to happen. And it's happening in Scotland too. Here, we don't have to go back to the 1950s, but we have to go back to 1979. The erosion of Conservative support that took place during the Thatcher major years, Theresa May seems to be on the brink of entirely reversing. Or I should say Theresa May and Ruth Davidson, and probably more Ruth Davidson than Theresa May. But nonetheless, we're looking at potentially a doubling of the Conservative vote from 2015 and a return to the kinds of levels of Conservative support that were seen before the Thatcher years. So back to the future. So, what is going on here? What is driving all of this extraordinary change? The argument I'm going to make, and I'm not going to claim that this is the entire story, as Bill McKenzie would say, politics encompasses everything, but talks about politics can't encompass everything, or they go on all night. So I'm going to offer a thesis about some of the things I think that matter. I think what we're seeing is the product of new divides opening up in the electorate, which are in turn the product of demographic change. We're seeing divides opening between the young and the old, between the diverse immigrant origin minority populations and the ethnic majority, and between degree holders and school leavers. And I think the reason these divides have opened up is because new conflicts have emerged in politics that pit these groups against each other. And those conflicts tend to focus on questions of identity. Who are we? Who threatens us? Where should power lie? Who should have it? How should it change? Who can join us, our country, and on what terms? These are powerful conflicts, in my view, because firstly, they divide the electorate deeply and in new ways. They matter a lot to a lot of voters on both sides. And there are now new or existing political parties that spend a lot of time talking about them and mobilising them. And in both countries, England and Scotland, there have been referendums that were designed in part to settle long-standing arguments on these issues. And in this respect, they utterly failed. Because in both cases, what they have done is further intensify the conflicts around these issues and further reorient politics around those conflicts. Now here, in my view, is one of the most important underlying graphs driving this stuff. If you look at the election of Trump, if you look at the Dutch election, if you look at the Austrian election, if you look at the Brexit vote, if you look at the independence referendum vote, you will find that one of the strongest predictors of behaviour in all of those cases is how long somebody was in the formal education system. The people who left school at 16 tend to behave in an entirely different way to the people who stick around and get a degree from university. And why does this matter? Well, because the share of the electorate that belongs to those two groups is steadily changing. I don't think that that divide is entirely new, but it was not very politically relevant back in the early 1980s when less than 1 voter in 10 went to university. It is much more relevant now when 5 in 10 young people will be going to university, and every year it becomes more relevant. On the other side of the coin, a group that was once so dominant in the electorate that they were practically invisible as a group, the white working class, that's a term that's only really come into debate in the last 5 to 10 years. And the reason it's come into a debate is because the white working class was just the electorate in most places 30 or 40 years ago. Now, it's less than 50% of the electorate, and its share shrinks every year. And that matters because those voters are aware of the fact that they are shrinking as a group, and that affects how they think about politics. They know they had more influence before than they do now, and they know that the way things are going, they're going to have even less in the future. On top of that, we have the rise of ethnic diversity, and that's important because in many, many ways, both in terms of their attitudes and in terms of their behaviour, ethnic minority and migrant voters tend to line up with the university graduates. So you get two groups, one of which I called in the book about UKIP the left behind, voters who have been left behind by social change, political change, and are seeing their influence in the political system gradually decline. And the other group is a group I would call confident cosmopolitans, the people who come out with degrees and the people who are from diverse backgrounds, who kind of embrace the social change that's happening, and in many cases would like to see it accelerate. They regard the change as a good thing. The other thing to remember about these changes is that they are extremely structured by age. So the proportion of voters in each age cohort who leave school at 16, if you go back to the 80s, 2/3 of the under 30s also left school at 16. That's now down to under 1/3. Whereas amongst the 70 plus, it was 90% back then, it's still above 70% now. So the difference between the experiences of the old and the young on these dimensions is really big. And as time has gone by, it's got bigger. The majority experience of a middle-aged person 1 generation ago is a minority experience for young people now. And so to the degree that that experience frames the way they think about politics, they're talking across each other. On the flip side, the share of young people who are graduates or from an ethnic minority background is rising very fast. It was under 10% in practically every age group in the early 1980s. It's above 30% in the younger age groups now. It will carry on rising every single year. Before too long, being either a university graduate or someone who's grown up with a migrant or minority background will be the majority experience for young people in the electorate. And all of this is, of course, led across another change which political scientists have known about for a long time and talked about rather more, which is the decline of traditional partisan tribal identifications. The share of voters who basically say they don't feel attached to any particular party has been rising steadily over time, but it's risen more amongst that left behind electorate of white voters who leave school early than it has amongst graduates and ethnic minorities. And that further exacerbates the sense of change in the political system because the confident cosmopolitan groups, these university graduates, minorities, diversity, multicultural liberals and so on, they're overrepresented amongst those who are taking part in politics. So they look even bigger than they are. The shift of gravity towards them looks even faster than it is. Whereas the group that's declining is leaving the political discussion, and that accelerates the sense of decline, intensifies the sense of marginalisation in that group. Now, all of that probably wouldn't matter very much unless these groups had things that divided them. It wouldn't matter if one group was growing and another group was shrinking if they had nothing to argue about. But the truth is that there are really big differences in how older white school leavers and younger graduates and ethnic minorities think about a range of issues, and those are the very issues that have moved to the centre of our political debate during this very disruptive decade. Things such as migration, things such as nationalism, things such as global versus local issues, the environment, foreign aid and so on, things such as liberal social values, equal opportunities, and things such as UKIP and Green voting. These are parties that package these things up together. So that's the big first shift. There's a slow but relentless change in the electorate. A group that once defined politics because it was so numerically dominant is no longer numerically dominant and no longer defines politics. And another group is growing fast but is not big enough yet to define politics. So instead you've got two groups, each too big for politics to ignore, but neither is big enough to fully set the agenda. Now this changes the way that the parties need to behave. Parties need to pay attention to big groups of voters, and they need, when they're thinking long run, to pay attention in particular to groups that are growing. On the other hand, they can't afford to ignore a group that's still big, even if it is shrinking. And all of this, the behavior of the parties and the trends themselves, feeds back to how the groups think and behave as well. There was a wonderful book recently written by an American, Justin Guest. He wrote it before the Trump election, and he compared voters in two white working class communities, Dagenham in London and Youngstown in Ohio. And what he found over and over again with them, that what predicted their tendency towards these anti-system options, UKIP, the BNP, Trump, the Tea Party, was a sense that they used to matter to the political system, but they matter less now, a sense of relative decline. And the truth is that when you look at the numbers, the sheer demographic numbers, that sense of relative decline has a basis in fact. They feel they matter less now because just on the raw numbers of votes, they do matter less now. In terms of which groups the parties have to pay attention to, they do matter less now. Conversely, the liberal middle-class groups who a generation or two would have been more willing to compromise with these kind of voters become steadily less willing to do so because they feel the future belongs to them, and they believe the future belongs to them because demography shows it probably does. Their numbers are rising. Their weight in the electorate is rising. So they say, well, why should we compromise now? Why should we give half away now? We're going to get it all soon enough. We should push for it now. So on the one side, decline produces defensiveness. On the other side, rise produces assertiveness. But there's also a role here for the political parties. One of my favorite US writers is a guy with the wonderfully unpronounceable name of E.E. Schatzschneider, who once observed that political organization is the mobilization of bias. There are a huge number of potential arguments and biases out there in the electorate, but only some of them get to define what the political argument is about. And the ones that get to define what the political argument is about are the ones that get organized into politics, which is where the parties come in. What has happened in both countries is that these new issues have been brought into the agenda by parties. In the case of England, it was the emergence of a new party that forced the old parties to pay attention to issues that they really would much rather have just left alone. In Scotland, it was the surging support for a much older party that suddenly discovered an audience for a set of issues that gave them an opportunity to rise to a position of genuine power. And in both cases, these are, for the most part, the very same issues that are splitting this declining left-behind segment of the electorate from this rising, confident, cosmopolitan segment of the electorate. And I put that second quote up here because I think this is important about what parties do. They get to define the alternatives. And the definition of alternatives is the supreme instrument of power, because when they say this is what the political argument is about, they frame the choice. Out of all the infinite number of things that an election could be about, it is what the parties work to make it about that it often ends up being about. And the supremely powerful thing that a new party can do is not necessarily to win votes or win seats. It is, as Nigel Farage himself observed, to change the argument. He never won a seat himself, but he changed the argument in English politics to make it about the issue he wanted it to be. That makes him more powerful than a lot of people who won a lot of seats. So, the pressures we see in England and Scotland on these issues is similar. The pattern of demographic change is similar. The emergence of new political conflicts is similar. The backfiring effect of referendums is similar, but the outcomes we've ended up with are rather different. In Scotland, a dominant party has been displaced by a new party that now dominates and is an avowedly nationalist party. It's an avowedly identity politics party. Whereas in England, an avowedly identity politics party appeared briefly and then kind of got eaten by one of the traditional parties, which has returned to a position of dominance it hasn't seen for 2 generations by consuming this new force. So there are interesting questions about why have these similar forces and similar events ended in rather different outcomes. Though one similar outcome, which is unfortunate if you are a Labour politician, is that in both countries these changes seem to have really screwed the Labour Party. So there's also the question of why the similarity on that front when there's difference on these other fronts. Now I think this reflects both what the professors in my field would call structure and agency. It reflects both the resources available to the parties in each country, which are similar but subtly different, but it also reflects the choices that the parties have made over time in mobilising those resources. So now I'm going to try and run through relatively speedily what's happened in each country in terms of this process. It's, in my view, a 3-stage process in each country. First, you have growing divides between these groups that create the potential for new political conflict. And then you get the mobilisation of that conflict by a new party, in this case UKIP. The second stage is the catalysing of change by a referendum campaign, normally, in both cases, brought in to settle a question that it then ends up just further polarising people over. And then you get a post-referendum political realignment. So, in England, I'll start with just the value divides. I just want to emphasise, I'll do these very briefly, the differences that we see here. So, what are the things that divide these cosmopolitan graduates from the people who leave school at 16? One thing is their acceptance of diversity. Young graduates and ethnic minorities think a multicultural Britain is a fine thing. Older white school leavers have their reservations, sometimes fairly strong reservations. A second thing is nationalism. And there's an interesting debate to be had about British versus English nationalism and British versus Scottish nationalism. But what's clear in the English case, at least, is that there is a kind of English nationalism, a nationalism that's based on blood and soil and descent and ancestry, that is popular amongst older school leavers, but has very little support amongst graduates and ethnic minorities. A third thing is political disaffection, and this is really long-standing. Graduates, and also interestingly ethnic minorities, tend to have a lot of faith in the political system and tend to believe it is responsible to what they have to say. Older school leavers, white school leavers, tend to think the opposite. They tend to think that the system does not listen to them and does not respond to them. Now that long predates all that has happened since. It's a long-standing pattern, but it is an important dividing pattern. That is the sort of fuel, if you will, for what came next. But the spark came from the issue of immigration. And in particular, in terms of what's happened in England, the most important date, in my view, was June 2004, which is when Tony Blair opted to accept immigration without limit from the A8 accession countries to Britain. The only large economy to do so. Sweden and Ireland also did. That led to a very sharp rise in immigration levels, which has continued ever since. And following that sharp rise, there was a very sharp rise in public concern about immigration. Immigration was named spontaneously by between 25% and 50% of the electorate as the most important issue to them in politics every single year from 2004 till the present day. That had never happened before for as long as we have polling. Not only was there an intensity of concern, it was the sheer length of time that people kept on saying, this is the issue we want resolved, year after year after year. That created the conditions in which people were going to say, I've had it, I want to try something new. And that concern was concentrated in these very left behind groups I'm talking about. And indeed what you see after the financial crisis in particular is that the minority of university graduates, professional middle class people who were worried about immigration, they all start worrying about the economy. They never go back to worrying about immigration. The left behind groups go back to worrying about immigration pretty fast, and then you get a situation where you get events like the controls on immigration mug, which was fascinating for somebody like me studying this, because it was just such a demonstration of this dialogue of the deaf. Because the liberal young graduate activists in that room, when Ed Miliband presented this mug that said we'll do controls on immigration, were just outraged. Why are you talking about this issue? None of us care about this issue, and in any case, we think immigration is a good thing. Whereas the people who the mug was aimed at were equally annoyed because they felt it was empty gesture politics, proved by the fact that everyone in the room was slagging it off. So you couldn't win. Both sides were polarized over this issue, but one saw no reason to talk about it at all, whereas the other saw no reason to talk about anything else. And when you look at people's attitudes on immigration, you see this really starkly. These are questions that got asked in the European Social Survey about whether immigration is a good thing economically and culturally. The young tend to think it is good. The old very much think it is bad. Graduates think immigration is fantastic. Nobody else agrees. Those who live in London think immigration is great. Those who live everywhere else in Britain do not. Those who are themselves first or second generation migrants, and that's a bigger population than you realise, because of course that includes the people who are the kids of Irish migrants or Dutch migrants or German migrants who aren't necessarily visible. I am, for example, a second generation migrant. My mum's Dutch. So that's a big chunk of the electorate, and they are very positive about immigration. But the segment of the electorate that has no family connection to migration, very negative. So the opening then came. This is the second key date. Is 2010, and David Cameron's manifesto pledge to bring migration down to the tens of thousands. It was important because up until that point, the voters tended to trust the Conservatives on immigration. In the lingo of our trade, the Conservatives owned the issue. Because of what had happened with Powell and Thatcher, people felt this was a party you could trust to really bear down on immigration and be tough on it. But so they made this pledge, and then nothing happened. The numbers went up. So trust in the Conservatives to deal with immigration collapsed. But people didn't react to this by saying, oh, well, we'll give Labour a go now for the reasons I was just illustrating. So instead they said, well, what do? We don't trust either of them on it anymore. And this is the point when all of a sudden support for UKIP, who had been banging on fruitlessly about the EU for the best part of 15 years at this point, and no one was paying much attention, all of a sudden they were getting a hearing. And they weren't getting a hearing on the EU particularly, they were getting a hearing on immigration from voters who had been trying to get someone to listen to them on immigration for years. And at this point, support for UKIP really takes off. And it takes off in those very left behind groups that I was telling you about. And it takes off amongst the voters who express the strongest affiliation to English nationalism, the voters who express the strongest disaffection with democracy, the voters who express the strongest opposition to politicians, and the voters who are against immigration, against equal opportunities, and against the EU. But the EU was only one part of that package. For many UKIP activists, it was the whole package. But they wouldn't have got anywhere with the EU alone. It was because the EU was tied up to this much broader identity politics package that they were able to really take off. During this same period, we see something. When Matt and I interviewed Nigel Farage, he said something very interesting about this. He said, I spent years and years and years trying to get people to see the EU and immigration as the same issue, and it didn't work. And then after 2004, I didn't have to, because they gave it back to me, my own arguments, spontaneously. They made the connection. And you see this in the data. This shows the strength of the relationship between people's views about immigration and their views about the EU. If you go back to the original 75 referendum, there is no correlation between those things at all. At that point, immigration was about the Empire and the Commonwealth and Enoch Powell and all that kind of thing. It was nothing to do with the EU. By the time we get towards Brexit Day, the relationship is so strong that they're more or less interchangeable. When you know people's views on one, you could know their views on the other with a great deal of confidence. Another way of looking at this, now that we get onto now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Brexit campaign. Here is what people spontaneously said when asked what are the most important issues in terms of their decision, whether to stay or leave the EU. You can pretty much guess which one's the leave and which one's the remain bubble. And you can see that they are not talking to each other at all. They are talking two completely different conversations. And one of the most prominent Leave campaigners, Daniel Hannan, I'm on Twitter a fair amount, as John will tell you. He tweeted out one day, there is no evidence at all that Leave voting was anything to do with immigration. And I tweeted out a picture of that Leave bubble, and I said, see if you can spot the word immigration, Dan. So, then we get to Brexit, and what we find in Brexit is that the vote to leave tracks the previous record-breaking 2014 UKIP vote very closely, but it's much higher. So the referendum had expanded this universe of voters who were voting seemingly on very similar grounds, very similar areas voting, but just a lot more all on the leave side. And once again, we see education is the strongest predictor, but far stronger in England than in Scotland. And we'll come on to why that might be in a little while. And again, we see the divides by age and social class, and again, we see the divides by social values. This shows the proportion of people who think the following things are a force for ill or a force for good, and how they voted. So people who think multiculturalism is a force for good, 80%. People think multiculturalism is force for ill, 80% vote leave. People who think multiculturalism is good, 70% vote remain. Liberalism, 80% say social liberalism is bad, they go leave. 68% of those who say it's good vote remain. And on down the line. So people were not voting on the basis of just the figure on the bus or the economic case one way or another. They had come to define these votes in terms of a very clear expression of a set of identities and values. The EU is multiculturalism, liberalism, feminism, Greens, globalization and the internet. If you like all of those things, then you vote for the EU. If you don't like all of those things, you vote against the EU. That's what we ended up with. Since then, the UKIP vote has more or less been eaten by the Conservatives, who have embraced more or less everything UKIP have asked for. Hard Brexit, immigration control, strong government, all of the things that UKIP have been banging on about for years. You know, Theresa May often does sound, and I say this as someone who researched UKIP for a long time, like a bit of a Nigel Farage sort of tribute act on these issues. But it's working. So you can see the electoral logic. This is a big chunk of the electorate, and she's chowed down on all of it, and it's put her in a really commanding position. And it's left us with this situation, and this is very little discussed in English politics, but perhaps that will have to change, where you have nationalism becoming a very strong predictor of vote. I mean, we know it's true in Scotland, it's not a surprise, there's a party with it in the name, but it's also true in England. Those who express the strongest attachment to Englishness vote Conservative overwhelmingly. That's the solid lines there. Those who express the least attachment to national identity vote overwhelmingly Labour. But the nationalists outnumber the cosmopolitans by a pretty hefty margin. So the net consequence of that is a major advantage to the Conservatives. So, on to Scotland. Again, 3 stages. Firstly, a growing disaffection of the Scottish electorate with a dominant but often seemingly absent Labour Party, which the SNP was able to exploit. Often not, I would say that this is one wrinkle in this that's interesting. I don't think that the SNP were really pushing these identity politics arguments when they first really came to prominence. Instead, they were pushing a subtly different argument, which is, we are the party that's focused on Scotland. We are the party that are focused on Scottish interests, which is as much as an identity argument. It is a kind of identity argument, but it's also a good politics argument. And so they recognised early on that in fact they wanted to downplay the more tribal aspects of identity in order to be acceptable to a broad enough electorate. But the independence referendum, I think, has changed that somewhat. It massively expanded support for the SNP's broad approach. It expanded support for independence. It mobilised segments of the electorate that had been thoroughly disengaged before, and it created this identity around independence and around voting yes that proved to be very potent politically. And now we have this new and still ongoing realignment after the independence referendum, where we've seen all of those, more or less, who support independence, all of the new converts to independence going over wholesale to the SNP, which produced, briefly, an alliance of both left-behind voters for whom independence was a way of basically sticking two fingers up at Westminster in England, and confident cosmopolitan voters who saw this as a way to achieve a progressive Scotland. So the SNP managed to face both ways on this issue, briefly. But, as I'll show you, Brexit seems to have put that ability to face both ways into question. So, if you look at these white, low qualification voters in Scotland, you find the same kind of resentments as you see in England on many issues, but you find an additional kind of resentment that doesn't exist in quite the same way in England, and that is resentment towards England. So you see that left-behind voters are more likely to think that it is England that benefits from the Union more than Scotland, that Scotland gets less than its fair share of money, that they don't trust the UK government, that the English in Scotland take jobs from Scots, that the English in Scotland will never really be true Scots, they'll always be more loyal to England, that Scotland would lose its identity if more English came, and that conflict between the Scottish and English is fairly or very serious. These are all attitudes that are more widely expressed amongst this left-behind group. Replace the word English with the word Europe or the word immigrant, and it's essentially a very similar psychology to UKIP. So there is a basic us versus them psychology here, but Scotland has a target for that doesn't exist in quite the same way in England. But what the SNP also managed to do was to develop a nationalist narrative for that rising confident cosmopolitan electorate that said, if you want a really progressive, outward-looking, inclusive Scotland, you need to be independent. We need to free ourselves from the English. And here you see that things like the belief that the gap between the rich and the poor will be smaller, that's more likely to be believed by these confident cosmopolitans. People would have more pride in an independent Scotland. That's more believed by these groups. Independence would make a lot of difference to my life. That's also something they believe more. And on the policy front as well. No fees, oppose Trident, and trust in the SNP government, all higher amongst these groups. So the SNP achieved something very unusual. They managed both to frame the issue of nationalism as independence and independence to those more resentful left-behind voters as an issue of the English are screwing you, and convince these more outward-looking cosmopolitan voters that nationalism was about delivering a progressive Scotland. They faced both ways. And they were able to do that in part because they had a uniquely powerful position after 2007 in terms of their reputation for competence, leadership. Salmond, Sturgeon, very popular. The SNP government, very popular. They were regarded as credible and effective defenders of Scottish interests, even by voters who didn't necessarily share their agenda on nationalism. That gave them a unique chance to make these arguments in an influential way. So, as I've said, the referendum campaign then expanded support for independence, and that support rose in both of those demographics that I have talked about, and by similar amounts. So it was a kind of across-the-board rise. And those dashed lines, that's the independence date, and the second one is the general election, and then the third one is the Scottish Parliament election in May 2016. And that in turn triggered a surge in support for the SNP, in particular amongst the most strongly nationalistic Scots, that's the top solid yellow line, but also amongst the ones who were moderately but not overwhelmingly nationalist. That used to be a solid vote for Labour. These dashed lines, you'll see Labour was round about 40, the SNP under 20, pre-referendum. Those positions more or less reversed by the end of that time. So it wasn't just the hardcore nationalists that were won over by this referendum process, it was also the ones who were, you know, felt Scottish but weren't going to sort of shout about it quite so much. But something then changed quite sharply around the time of the EU referendum. And I think the reason for this is because those voters, these left-behind voters who have this sense of there are these outsiders who threaten us and we don't trust them and they don't represent our interests, that kind of feeling had been directed towards the English, but those voters tended also to be Eurosceptic because they felt the same way about Brussels and the EU. There was a lot of Euroscepticism latent there in the left-behind segment of that SNP coalition, and that came to the surface after Brexit and the SNP being forced to take a position on Brexit. They firmly embraced the case for the EU, which made them very popular with the graduates and ethnic minorities, the confident cosmopolitans, but lost them a big chunk of support very quickly amongst the ethnocentric voters who basically regard the EU as another out-of-touch, outsider group, basically telling us what to do and we don't want them. And that in turn is costing the SNP a lot of support amongst Leave voters. Indeed, before Brexit, they were the leading party amongst Leave voters with around 40%. Now, they've lost that position to the Conservatives, who have about that share, 40%, and they're down to about 30%. So voters who are SNP but Leave are leaving the SNP. And the Conservatives are discovering a new identity politics base as a result. And it's basically Brexit and union. So we want to stay, we want to get out of this awful multinational monstrosity, the European Union, but we need to stay in this other marvellous multinational political unit, the United Kingdom. That combination of views is held by about a fifth of Scots, and the Conservatives now get about 60% of support from that segment. So it gives them a solid base of operations in this new identity politics divide. So, nearly done. Just to recap what I've been trying to argue for you, I think that these kind of large-scale demographic shifts are really often the engine of political change. It's like, I did geography A-level, it's like plate tectonics. These things are slow, but the pressures that build up are immense, and then eventually they get released in the extraordinary earthquakes, such as the ones we've seen over the past few years. These new disputes are now there. They're now at the heart of the political argument, and it's unlikely that that genie goes back into the bottle, in my view. And I would add that while I've made this a story about 2 bits of these British Isles, it's not unique to 2 bits of these British Isles. This same story is the story of how Trump surprised America. It's the story of how the French ended up voting for 2 people who weren't from traditional political parties, how the Austrians ended up voting for 2 people who weren't from traditional parties, how the biggest success story in the Dutch election wasn't the Freedom Party, which is the sort of left-behind party that everyone was expecting. It was the Green Left, who were the confident cosmopolitan party on the other end of the scale. So we're seeing these dynamics, in my view, all over the place. And now I'm just going to end with 3 questions that I'm posing, but I haven't got answers to. The first is, why have yes and leave proved to be more potent post-referendum identities than no and remain? In both cases, it seems that the side that was associated with change, regardless of whether they got the change or not, has been more emotionally engaged with the aftermath than the side that was arguing for the status quo. In Britain, this has ended up with a lot of sort of sneering at Brexit sore winners. They won, and yet they still seem to be pretty much as wound up as they were before. I suspect this is to do with the underlying psychology of the people who are voting for these parties. These referendums, the change option engaged people who were very disaffected with the status quo and felt things were going backwards for them. These referendums massively inflated the expectations of those groups that that situation was going to change and was going to change radically. And they have therefore become very emotionally engaged to that process of change. And one thing I'm concerned about is that that process of change is very unlikely to deliver what they expect of it. And so at some point there will be a reckoning and a letdown for that group, and that in turn could produce further political disruption. The second question is why is all this hurting Labour more? I was hoping to spend more of this talk sort of answering that question, but I haven't been able to yet, so I'm going to have to save that for a future talk. I suspect what's going on is that this is also to do with numbers and balance. Labour in both countries has faced a situation where they can't afford to take either position without alienating a group that is vital to them. but the position of not taking a position ends up being just as harmful as either position would be. So in England, all of those MPs representing Rust Belt type seats can't afford to alienate those Brexit inclined voters, so don't want to take your pro-EU, cosmopolitan, pro-immigration position. But on the other hand, all of those MPs representing London and Manchester and Birmingham are now furious about Brexit and very pro-immigration and very pro-diversity, and they no longer want to shut up about it. So neither side, both of those groups are vital to the Labour Party. Both of those groups provide MPs with their majorities. But what's the middle position? There isn't a middle position. The middle position is trying to avoid talking about it, which seems to have been English Labour's approach to this, and they should learn a lesson from their Scottish cousins on that, because trying to avoid talking about the independence referendum and its consequences has really not done Scottish Labour any favours at all. They've ended up being seen as too unionist for the nationalists and not unionist enough for the hardcore unionists. They've been supplanted by the Conservatives as the party of union. So you end up with a situation where Labour cannot afford to take a side, and it cannot afford not to take a side. And that's a terrible position to be in if you're a political party. And ultimately, it's down to both the balance of votes in the electorate and how the argument changed. And that's all, in a sense, beyond Labour's control. So I think sometimes we place the blame on the symptoms, such as poor leaders and so on, but there are root causes here that are actually very difficult for Labour to address. And finally, why has all of this worked so well for the Conservatives in both countries? Well, again, I think there's a legacy and a balance story here. In both countries, the Conservatives have had a long-standing historic association with one side of this argument. So in England, Conservative nationalism and opposition to immigration, that was a very salient and prominent position in Thatcher's time. It was salient and prominent before that with Powell. Euroscepticism too, of course, is notoriously something that's been a big part of the Conservative Party's internal debate for a long time. So it has been relatively easy for them to embrace one side in this argument and to do it credibly. Because people will say, yes, that is who you are, we remember from before. And the same in Scotland. When the Conservatives turn around and say, yeah, we are the party of union, we mean it, again, they can point to a long history of obstinate opposition to essentially every bit of the devolution process, which didn't really work well for them early on, but now plays in their favour, because when they're saying you need a party that's going to stand up for Britain and the Union, people will say, well, yeah, your track record is that's what you do. But, on the other hand, that's a relatively small segment of the overall Scottish electorate, so it gets them a sort of solid, bigger base, but it possibly also puts a ceiling on what they can get. So, where do we go next? Well, I don't know. I think anyone who said they know what's going to come in the next year or two will be making a fool of themselves. Indeed, I have made a fool of myself by making predictions about what would happen in the next year or two, so I won't do it again. I do think that we will see further disruption. The process is not fully worked out yet, and we don't know how it's going to play. We don't know how the inevitable disappointment of the Brexit process will impact on the voters who vested so many hopes in them. We don't know how the debate over a second independence referendum would play, and what would happen if it was lost. Again, would these voters who vested such hopes in that change, how would they react to it not happening a second time? And on the other hand, these groups that are growing, they're going to carry on growing, and how are they going to behave? Are they going, like the Left Behind voters did over the past 5 or 10 years, at some point going to say, you know what, the hell with the traditional parties, they keep compromising on this stuff, we don't want to compromise on it anymore, we want something new. That has started happening in a lot of European countries. It's harder, at least in the UK electoral system, to do, but in Scotland, where you've got a more proportional electoral system, it's a lot easier. So maybe that's something that could happen here. Who knows? I certainly don't. I will stop there and take some questions.
Thank you very much, Rob, for giving a lecture which I'm sure Bill McKenzie would have been proud of, let alone anybody else. There is a roving microphone. I'll be looking for questions at the moment, but I'll just start us off. If it's true that the Scottish National Party, as you portrayed it, succeeded, at least until recently, in getting both the left behind and the confident cosmopolitans on the same side of the fence. What then is the underlying engine that generates the support for independence and for the SNP? I mean, south of the border, you seem to be saying it's to do with immigration. Immigration and associated issues of social conservatism divides these two groups. Ergo, and the anger of the left behind drives the support for leave. But I'm not clear what north of the border is your explanation as to why support for independence and for the SNP reaches the height as it did before, where there may or may not be some fracturing as a result of the Brexit referendum.
Well, the short answer is I'm not entirely sure, because what you see if you look in the data, like in the British election study data following it wave by wave, is that the support rises amongst all of these groups. But I find it hard to believe that the same arguments were working in the same way with all of them. I mean, maybe there is an argument here that I'm missing that works with all of them. It's possible that the argument that's, you know, a very vague and broadly pitched argument like Scotland is different, Scotland deserves something better, Scotland deserves something new, could work with both of these groups because they hear very different things in such statements.
Well, one argument I suppose that might be put to you is that perhaps in both cases you're underestimating the role of economic arguments, and that, as you will be perfectly well aware, immigration is not just a cultural issue, it's also an economic issue, and that the concern of the left behind is the fact that it's the mingling of the two, right? But that equally then north of the border, okay, confident cosmopolitans may buy into the nationalist vision of a civic nationalist Scotland and a progressive Scotland, but there was also a very clear message for the left behind, which is we're going to create a more equal society. But that's a much more of an economic argument, and one might almost want to say to you, old-fashioned class politics at play.
Yeah, I wouldn't discount it. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are, you know, this is not a complete account, this is a partial account.
Okay.
In the final product of this, we will look at these competing factors, and I completely agree. I mean, it's hard to believe that class and economics didn't play some role. But conversely, in my view, if it was all about class and economics, why would we be having a debate about independence at all?
Well, okay. So open up to you. There's a lady right at the back. Yes, that's you. I'm pointing out, sorry. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Christy Nielsen. Yes, I was very interested in your talk, thank you. There were a couple of points you might have seen me fidgeting in my seat here, because a high level of focus on your arguments were about immigration in England, that's why they voted leave. And I was trying to imagine a couple of friends who voted leave, and they'd be jumping up and down in their seats if they thought that immigration was what was driving them to vote, because in fact they just didn't want to be in Europe. And I've a funny feeling that the political landscape has changed, not just in England, not just in Scotland, not in Wales, not in Northern Ireland. It's changed in France, Holland, America, Germany. Europe and USA no longer have the power or the political landscape that they all had. A lot of them are wanting to decentralise because they feel the power has gone in large groups as opposed to within countries. A lot of them feel that they've lost some of their culture.
Could you come to the question,
And I'll
please?
come to the question, how would you respond that these are world changes, because new leaders are emerging, such as Trump, who play, such as Le Pen, who play on Farage, who play on the idea that industrial decline has caused a lot of problems, you've got left behind, you've got no solutions, but will create fear in others. Is this not just something that's endemic of the European and American world, as opposed to purely nationalism or immigration?
Well, I mean, on the first point, I should emphasise that when something predicts a vote, it doesn't determine a vote, particularly a big vote like the vote for Brexit. So the fact that immigration was a big factor doesn't mean it was a complete factor. Obviously, there were lots of other reasons to vote for Brexit, and not everyone who voted for Brexit voted on the basis of immigration. But it did weigh heavily in the overall pattern of how people behaved. On the second issue, this is a very vexed debate. You see the Americans wrestling with it a lot with regards to Trump. Is this identity, is this economics? John, you were mentioning something very similar. My own view is that often it becomes a bit of a false sort of binary. It's both. They interact with each other. If you experience economic decline, you retreat into defensive identities, you become more intolerant, you become more disaffected. Is that a product, and then is the way you behave subsequently a product of the economic situation or a product of the identity attachments? Well, it's actually an interaction between the two, because not everyone reacts to economic decline by becoming defensive and nationalistic and so on. And not everybody who's defensive and nationalistic does so in reaction to economic decline. But for some people, you see that dynamic. And I think picking one of them and saying that's the one that matters and that one is secondary is actually pretty difficult to do.
Okay. There's a gentleman here towards the front in a blue shirt, and then there's a gentleman here afterwards. Would you mind saying who you are as well, please? So I should have said that earlier.
My name is Mark Ryan. I'm visiting here from Canada. You mentioned the party leaders, mentioned the competence of the SNP leaders. What would have happened if the other Miliband brother had been the leader of Labour? Would that have changed things significantly?
You mean in the Brexit vote?
The decline of Labour. So you talk about the demographic changes, but had Labour had the other Miliband brother as the leader, would that have made a big difference?
Well, it's very hard to know. It's a difficult counterfactual. They would have faced the same dilemma of that whatever change, whatever position they took on this was going to anger and potentially alienate an important part of their coalition, but maybe they would have taken a different choice and that would have had consequences. So similarly, May had to decide to what extent she was going to embrace Brexit. And she decided to embrace it completely and try and gamble on getting the whole UKIP vote. Now, that was actually a pretty high-risk strategy because there is a big chunk of the Conservative vote that is also graduate, socially liberal and so on, and their strategists have also got to be concerned that in the long run, what they're doing is grabbing a declining demographic. So it may not have worked. I mean, one of the interesting questions that I'm sure every Lib Dem is asking themselves every night is why didn't any of those liberal pro-EU Conservatives walk out the door? May couldn't have known in advance that they wouldn't, but she gambled, she made that decision, and now she gets this 45% plus coalition. A different Labour leader might have made a different gamble on these issues and it might have had a different result. But what that result would be, who knows?
My name is George English. Very thought-provoking. What was going through my mind as you said that was, going back to Scottish independence, the thought that the SNP were able to benefit from divide and rule, that the pro-union three parties never really got the act together in terms of here are the arguments for. And what's happened now to an extent is the Tories are the ones who picked up that much more and indeed have benefited partly by saying that SNP, all you're about is independence.
So sorry, what's the question?
Well, to comment on that what has happened, the reason that the Tories have risen and so forth, is because the argument for union is now a bit clearer.
Yeah.
And equally, they're, to an extent, well, you comment, the SNP now seen as being almost all about independence.
I'll put it slightly differently for you. It has been suggested that the person who would be most discombobulated if Nicola Sturgeon were to announce tomorrow that she was not going to pursue a second independence referendum would be Ruth Davidson.
Yeah, no, I see the point, because on the one hand, you've got a clear argument to make to voters who are keen to see Brexit and want to leave the EU, which is a significant minority of Scottish voters. And on the other hand, you've got a clear argument to make to voters who don't want another independence referendum, want to stay in the EU. So yeah, you've got a really clear double argument that you can make to a big segment of the electorate that really defines why the union is something they want to keep. So I would agree with you on that. I think that's been very valuable to them. And again, it's an interesting example of a political leader. This is structure and agency again. Sturgeon obviously faced pressure to call for a second referendum. She gambled. She didn't know what effect that would have on how voters saw the whole thing. And at present, we obviously don't know how it'll pan out. It looks like a certain chunk of her broad coalition is now starting to wonder about walking out of the door because of Brexit and because of the feeling that actually the issue should have been settled and they don't want another independence referendum.
Okay, but more questions? Sorry, yes, there's a gentleman back at the back, yep.
Hi there, my name's Gavin, I'm a PhD student here at Glasgow. I was thinking about the quotation from the scholar whose name is hard to pronounce, about defining the alternative gives you a lot of power, basically, and you spoke about Nigel Farage in this context. So, and how even without a seat, he had the power to kind of define the argument and the Tories followed him. So, I'm wondering to what extent do you think that was Nigel Farage's powers of persuasion, as it were, for him to be able to define the argument, or whether there was deeper structural changes going on and he was there at the right place at the right time? And in terms also of what's going to happen next, is it going to be the case that we might have some great orator come out and it will completely change the situation?
Yeah, I mean, can I just expand on that? I mean, one could argue, because you talked about, organisation, about the mobilisation of bias. Well, let's add a Weberian concept to this, charisma. It so happens that both the Leave campaign across the UK and the Nationalist campaign here were both led by extraordinarily charismatic politicians without whom perhaps, despite all the pressures that you've talked about and all the structural changes, maybe none of this would have happened.
Yeah, and I would not dispute that. And in fact, like in the years I've been working on UKIP, the number one question I get, and the fact that it's the number one question I get is sort of a little bit of an answer to your question in itself, is what is the value added of Nigel Farage? Why is he important? Is he important? And so on. And I think that, smarter people than I work on leadership have categorized this more effectively, but it does work both internally and externally. It works internally, and I'm sure this is true for Sturgeon as well, because a really charismatic, powerful, respected leader gets everyone marching in the same line. And when you're dealing with people like UKIP, getting everyone marching in the same line is a pretty big achievement in itself. And as we have seen, as soon as Farage departed the scene, I predicted it at the time. I said, you'll see how much Farage matters internally to UKIP when he's not leader anymore, because they'll fall to bits. And that's exactly what happened. But the other thing is, because he's charismatic, he gets a hearing for his argument far more than a less charismatic leader. Indeed, far more than the less charismatic leaders that have followed have done. He gets the hearing on all the big TV shows. He gets the hearing with Conservative MPs, for example, who would see what he was saying and how he was saying it and think again about the issue. He gets the hearing with people like Douglas Carswell who come over. So yes, these kind of leaders matter, because getting the argument changed to what you want it changed to is an extraordinarily difficult pursuit. The other thing that Schatzsnyder talks about is how once an argument is set up in politics, all the people who structure politics around that argument have a very strong incentive to work together to keep politics about that argument. It threatens them if the argument changes. And indeed, a predecessor in politics who achieved something similar was Enoch Powell. And if you go back to the earliest David Butler books, they say, when we look at the British election study data in the 1960s, there's this extraordinary anger about immigration. But neither Labour nor the Conservatives will talk about immigration because both of them regarded it as disruptive and explosive and dangerous. Powell, another charismatic politician, forced them to talk about the issue, and by making them talk about the issue, he revealed its electoral power and thereby changed the argument. It's a very similar dynamic with Farage, and on a very different issue and in a very different way with Salmond and Sturgeon, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Have we got drinkies afterwards? We've got drinkies afterwards, that's the good news. You're all thirsty in this heat. One final left field question. This is a conversation, believe it or not, I was having yesterday. So amongst, you've talked about how immigration and a variety of other social issues, they're correlated with age and education. There is, of course, something else that's also historically been associated with age and education, which is relationships, attitudes towards sexual mores, including, not least, same-sex relationships. So let me pose to you the question that was posed to me yesterday, which is, how is it that we as a society, or at least a section of our society, is still quite considerably exercised about immigration, when it comes to same-sex relationships, the argument seems to be almost completely over, and virtually everybody is a social liberal.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think, you know, if I had a talented master's student coming to me and saying, I want to do a PhD about social attitudes, I'd say write it on that, because I think it's a terrific puzzle. It's the biggest liberal shift in attitudes, and not just here, but in many countries, that we have seen. I don't have a comprehensive answer. I have only a sketchy hypothesis that is derived, and I'm sad to admit it, from an op-ed columnist, but quite a important figure in this debate, Andrew Sullivan, who was one of the early proponents of gay marriage. And his argument for gay marriage from the beginning, and in the initial period, he was very much opposed on it by gay activists, whose position was gay relations are different, gay people are different, and everyone has to accept that. Andrew Sullivan's argument for gay marriage was, it shows that we are the same as everybody else, and we just want the same as everybody else. There's nothing threatening about us, there's nothing different about us, we're just like you and your family, we just love somebody different. And his position was, if that argument took hold, it would be a far more effective driver of social change, because it wouldn't require people to upend any of their other views. All they would have to do is say, well, these people feel this way about people of the same gender, and that's just fine. And I think that that has something to it. And it also may explain why this doesn't travel to other issues so easily, because that combination of we change this one thing and everything else stays the same, so you don't need to be threatened by it, doesn't really work as well on some of these other social issues.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much, Rob.